You shared some really compelling material with us, this time excerpts detailing Bruce's early experiences in college. We're diving into episode 2, Boy Meets Girl and Overcoming Shyness, along with the running theme guide.pdf, covering, well, the initial chapters of what sounds like a fascinating memoir.
Exactly. You've given us a close-up look at Bruce during his college years as he grappled with being, in his own words, an invisible and shy person. Our aim in this deep dive is to really understand his journey, how he started to find pathways through this significant personal challenge. We want to pinpoint what resonates as particularly powerful in his story and what elements might compel someone to pick up his book and read it cover to cover.
Absolutely. From what you sent over, we're going to be tracing Bruce's initial feelings of isolation in this new college environment, his unexpected involvement with fraternity, the role of therapy in his life, and his active learning of social skills, and those tentative first steps he took toward romantic connections. Okay, so let's jump right in. He describes this feeling of being on steel train tracks, heading straight for college.
What's interesting about that image of steel train tracks is the sense of a predetermined path, isn't it? College wasn't presented as a choice, but like an inevitability. He also mentions this tension between wanting to leave his high school band life behind and feeling obligated to it for college applications. It highlights how societal or familial expectations can sometimes, overshadow an individual's true desires or sense of self.
And then there's this really significant moment, his acceptance to Georgia Tech. He points out that they seemingly didn't place much importance on his extracurricular activities, which was quite different from the image he had of the Ivy League schools. There's a real sense of relief in his words.
That relief is telling. It suggests that perhaps Bruce felt seen for something other than the typical achievements or performances. For a prestigious institution like Georgia Tech to value something beyond those traditional metrics could have been an early, albeit unspoken, affirmation of his inherent worth, shifting away from a purely achievement-based sense of self.
What really struck me was his description of leaving his family. He mentions a distinct lack of grief or terror, just this overwhelming relief, which he even recognized as perversely wrong. That absence of expected emotion really hints at a detached upbringing, wouldn't you say?
It certainly does. That lack of anticipated emotional response speaks to a potential disruption in early attachment. As the running theme guide touches on with the theme of emotional deprivation and the birth of shame from episode 1, this early relational landscape likely played a significant role in the development of his shyness and difficulties with connection later on.
Yeah.
Then he arrives at orientation, and it's not the picture of camaraderie you might expect. He describes it as a lonely crowd and felt like an outcast, particularly during those forced social activities like river rafting. That sounds incredibly alienating. It really highlights the internal conflict he was facing. He had this intense fear of his perceived otherness being exposed, coupled with this powerful need to appear normal. Those kinds of forced social situations would have amplified his anxiety, making genuine connection feel even more unattainable. It underscores the immense energy he must have been expending just trying to, manage his internal state.
And in the midst of all this, there's that stark statistic about the low graduation rate at Georgia Tech that was mentioned during orientation. It makes you wonder if that added another layer of pressure, a need to find his place, not just socially, but perhaps even as means of survival in a challenging academic environment.
That's a fascinating point. In a high-pressure environment like that, the need to belong could easily extend beyond personal well-being to a perceived necessity for academic success. Finding a supportive community might have felt crucial for navigating those academic challenges.
We then see him take a really pivotal step, seeking help at the Counseling and Career Planning Center due to this gnawing loneliness. He even comes to this important realization that social skills were a crucial lesson at Georgia Tech, perhaps even more vital for him than the engineering studies that didn't particularly resonate with him. This marks a significant moment of self-awareness, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Recognizing that the core issue wasn't solely academic, but deeply social, represents a huge leap in understanding himself. His initial thought that he needed connections to survive and pass his classes, not necessarily for romantic fulfillment, speaks volumes about his fundamental needs at that stage. It suggests a primary focus on safety and belonging in a new and potentially overwhelming environment.
It's also interesting how he includes this detail about his lack of calculus knowledge due to social anxiety in 7th grade, and then the surprising ease with which he later grasped the subject. It's almost as if he's highlighting how his shyness had created unexpected obstacles in his life, but also hinting at his underlying potential when that anxiety wasn't in the way.
Exactly. It's a subtle but powerful illustration of how pervasive anxiety can be, creating these seemingly arbitrary barriers to learning and personal growth. It also offers a glimpse of his innate capabilities when those barriers are removed. Yeah.
Okay, so Bruce has recognized the problem. He's taking the courageous step of seeking help. But he's still in those isolating dorms. He describes the dread of another lonely evening and then this beacon of hope, a barbic. Tell us about the significance of his decision there.
What really stands out is the sheer act of agency. For someone who describes himself as invisible, making the conscious decision to approach two other students and ask to join them at fraternity parties was a significant step outside his comfort zone. It demonstrates a deep underlying desire for connection, finally outweighing his fear of potential rejection. That small action held immense personal weight.
And that leads him to Rush Week at Zeta Beta Tau. He describes the atmosphere there as electrifyingly different from the other fraternities he encountered. What do you think it was about ZBT that resonated with him in that way?
The narrative suggests a couple of key elements. Firstly, there was the sheer energy and apparent inclusivity of the environment. Secondly, Bruce's approach during Rush was quite telling. Instead of forcing himself into interactions he wasn't comfortable with, he adopted an observational stance, absorbing information and perhaps feeling a sense of belonging simply by being present in that lively atmosphere. This passive engagement likely felt much safer and more manageable than direct social interaction.
He also mentions the love bombing aspect, acknowledging that he was aware it was a recruitment strategy. But even with that awareness, it still had a noticeable effect on him. It's a fascinating point about how the need for acceptance can override our rational understanding of a situation.
It truly is. When someone has experienced a sense of emotional deficit, even a consciously recognized strategy of intense positive attention can be incredibly powerful in filling that void. It speaks to a fundamental human need for validation and belonging, especially during vulnerable periods of transition.
Then comes the moment of declaring his pledge, which he describes as Herculean task due to his deep-seated fear of being in the spotlight. Yet he pushes through his reluctance and does it. That must have represented a huge internal victory for someone like Bruce.
Absolutely. For someone who habitually sought invisibility, forcing himself into a moment of public declaration, despite the intense anxiety it provoked, signifies a profound act of self-confrontation. It was a tangible step towards challenging his shyness, even if it felt incredibly difficult in the moment. This kind of experience, however small it might seem externally, can be a major turning point in someone's internal landscape.
But the dynamics shift quite noticeably after Rush Week, don't they? Bruce goes from feeling like a special recruit to a lowly pledge with a whole new set of obligations, like wearing suits and participating in the pledge paddle ritual. Sounds like a bit of a jarring transition.
It highlights the often hierarchical and sometimes ritualistic nature of these organizations. The initial focus on recruitment and creating a positive impression gives way to the more structured realities of membership. Bruce's quiet resistance to some of these rules, in an attempt to remain less conspicuous, reveals that his underlying tendency towards invisibility was still very much present, creating an internal tension between wanting to belong and wanting to avoid attention.
He also touches on the constant presence of studying and homework at the frat house, serving as a constant reminder of the new expectations governing his life. And then there's the mystery surrounding the initiation and the various group tasks intended to build unity, though Bruce seems somewhat skeptical of their true purpose. Even the secret handshake felt a bit performative to him, just for show.
These details paint a picture of Bruce navigating a new social environment with his own internal compass. He's participating to some extent, but also critically observing the dynamics, trying to decipher the unspoken rules and the performative aspects of belonging to this group. It reflects a mind actively trying to make sense of a new social code.
He concludes his reflections on this first quarter with a real mix of emotions, excitement, and uncertainty, feeling a sense of improvement, yet still experiencing inner turmoil. He valued the distance from his family, but felt the loss of familiar comforts, with the counseling sessions offering a fragile glimmer of hope. It sounds like a very complex and human experience of navigating this new chapter.
It perfectly captures the multifaceted nature of leaving home and attempting to forge a new identity. There's the liberation from a potentially difficult past environment, but also the inherent anxieties of an unknown future and the loss of whatever sense of security, however imperfect, the past provided. The introduction of therapy as a source of hope is a crucial thread that will likely continue to develop in his story.
Okay, let's move forward now to Bruce's senior year. He mentions these significant personal goals, speaking up in class and asking a girl out, noting that he had been in therapy at Georgia Tech's Counseling and Career Planning Center for 5 years by this point. 5 years really underscores the depth and persistence of the challenges he was working to overcome.
It truly does. The fact that it took that length of time for him to feel ready to ask someone out for the first time highlights just how deeply ingrained his shyness and social anxiety were. This wasn't a quick fix. It was a sustained and dedicated effort over many years. It speaks to the profound nature of the obstacles he was facing and the commitment he made to addressing them.
He actively started learning social skills during this period, things like how to initiate conversations and practice active listening, and he even recognizes how valuable these skills became later in his career as a psychotherapist. There's a real sense of irony there, isn't there? Someone who struggled so profoundly with social interaction ultimately built his professional life around understanding and facilitating it in others.
This aligns perfectly with the surreal irony of growth highlighted in the running theme guide. Bruce's personal journey through social anxiety became the very foundation of his professional expertise. The therapy group he participated in provided a safe environment to practice these newly learned skills, and the realization that others shared similar struggles must have been incredibly validating and normalizing for him.
Mhm.
He also mentions the three-column technique from cognitive behavioral therapy, identifying the thought, the distortion, and the challenge as a really key tool in his efforts to combat negative thinking patterns. Can you elaborate on why this particular technique might have been so effective for Bruce? What's particularly powerful about this technique is that it provides a structured and actionable method for Bruce to examine and question the automatic negative thoughts that were likely fueling his anxiety. By learning to identify the cognitive distortions present in his thinking, things like catastrophizing or mind reading, he could then actively challenge those thoughts with more realistic and balanced perspectives. This gave him a sense of agency over his internal dialogue, which would have been transformative for someone who often felt controlled by their anxieties in social situations.
He describes his shyness not just as a personality trait, but as a shield and a survival strategy that he had outgrown but didn't know how to discard. He says that this technique gave him a sense of control over his anxiety. That's a really insightful way to frame it.
It emphasizes the functional role that shyness played for him. It likely served as a protective mechanism in earlier, perhaps emotionally challenging environments. Recognizing it as a learned behavior rather than an inherent flaw opened up the possibility of unlearning it. The three-column technique provided a tangible method for dismantling that old defense mechanism.
He then touches on this recurring experience of always being the extra person in friendships and relationships someone trusted but not quite fully included. That feeling of being on the periphery must have been a significant emotional burden.
This really resonates with the running motif of the extra person that the theme guide identifies. While he was able to form connections, there was still this underlying sense of not being fully integrated, of being somewhat on the outside looking in. However, as the guide also points out, these marginal experiences, while perhaps painful, still offered opportunity for observation and learning about social dynamics.
He shares this poignant story about dancing with Mary, the maid of honor, at his best friend's wedding. He was completely out of his element with dancing, and he had the fleeting thought of actually asking her out. It sounds like a small but significant moment of pushing against his self-imposed limitations, even if just internally.
It shows a growing willingness to entertain romantic possibilities, even in the face of his acknowledged inexperience and underlying anxiety. The fact that the thought even crossed his mind represents a step forward in his journey toward greater social engagement and a loosening of his inhibitions.
Then comes the encounter with Marlisa at the post-wedding party. Apparently, she was showing clear signs of interest in him, but he initially didn't even register it, or perhaps refused to believe it. It's as if his ingrained shyness created a filter that blocked out positive social cues.
Exactly. His past experiences likely conditioned him to anticipate indifference or even rejection, making it incredibly difficult for him to recognize and accept genuine signs of interest, even when they were quite obvious to others, as his friend Jolie pointed out. It speaks to how deeply our past experiences can shape our present perceptions.
That moment with the dog seems particularly telling. Marlisa noticed his discomfort and gently intervened, then checked to see if he was okay. Bruce says that seemingly small act made her interest feel real to him. It was a subtle gesture, but it broke through his wall of disbelief.
It underscores the power of small, empathetic actions in fostering connection, especially for someone who felt so often unseen or overlooked. For Bruce, who was accustomed to a certain level of social invisibility, this moment of being noticed and cared for in a quiet, personal way was profoundly impactful.
And then Marlisa takes a significant step and directly invites him to an Easter play at her church. This was a clear and unambiguous invitation, and Bruce even allowed himself to believe that he was finally chosen. It must have felt like a major turning point in his internal narrative about his own desirability.
It was a direct affirmation, moving beyond any ambiguity in her interest. This kind of explicit invitation likely felt like a significant validation, representing real progress in his journey towards overcoming his sense of social invisibility and unworthiness in romantic contexts.
But then, after the play during their walk, he hesitantly attempts to kiss her and she turns away. He describes it as bizarre and embarrassing, especially since he felt his attempt was minimal and not forceful. He was filled with shame and the thought that he had read it wrong and was stupid. It sounds like a really painful setback.
This encounter with Marlisa, as the theme guide highlights, beautifully illustrates the complex interplay of progress and ongoing challenges. He took a significant risk by acting on his feelings, but he misread the social cues. His subsequent reaction, the intense shame, the self-criticism, the immediate withdrawal, echoes his earlier experience with Michelle at the post office and underscores his tendency to let embarrassment shut him down and reinforce his negative self-perceptions.
He mentions his regret at not expressing his true feelings to Michelle and notes that he didn't pursue things further with Marlisa, partly because she was attending another college and partly because his own investment wasn't that deep beyond the initial thrill of being noticed. It seems he was still navigating the delicate balance between a genuine desire for connection and the more primal need to simply feel seen.
That's a crucial distinction. While he was making strides in overcoming his shyness and initiating social contact, he was still in the process of learning the intricacies of genuine romantic interest and understanding his own motivations within those interactions.
Yeah. Now, let's delve into the running theme guide.pdf to really highlight some of the core themes that emerge from these early episodes of Bruce's story. It points to emotional deprivation and the birth of shame in episode 1 as a foundational element in understanding his shyness.
Yes, this concept of early experiences of insufficient nurturing leading to a deep-seated sense of shame is a critical underpinning of his entire narrative. It directly connects to the development of what the guide refers to as a disorganized avoidant attachment style, characterized by a desire for closeness coupled with a fear of intimacy and the adoption of selective mutism as a coping mechanism in early life.
And the recurring motif of the ghost and Bruce's tendency to become invisible as a defense mechanism really ties everything together, doesn't it? It serves as a central metaphor for his early experiences and his way of navigating the social world.
Perfectly encapsulates his primary strategy for dealing with the world that may have felt overwhelming or emotionally unsafe. By becoming invisible, he could effectively minimize his exposure to potential judgment, criticism, or hurt.
But then we witness the beginnings of a shift towards the emergence of hope and self-reclamation and learning to speak again during his college years. It's as if the college environment, despite its initial challenges, provided a new context where that long-standing invisibility could begin to dissipate.
Despite the continued presence of fear and anxiety, being away from what the guide describes as his parents' toxic control created a space for him to begin to redefine himself and experiment with new ways of relating to others, gradually moving away from that ingrained defensive posture.
The guide emphasizes that for Bruce, cognitive behavioral therapy and the counseling he received weren't just academic exercises, but rather survival strategies for building a sense of internal safety. That really resonates with his description of finding control through the three-column technique.
Absolutely. These therapeutic tools provided him with concrete methods for managing his overwhelming anxiety and challenging the deeply ingrained negative perceptions he held about himself. This process of actively working on his internal landscape was crucial in fostering a sense of stability and self-efficacy that had been lacking.
And the motif of the extra person always present, but never quite central, is a recurring pattern in his social interactions. Yet the guide astutely points out that these marginal experiences still afforded him valuable opportunities for observation and learning. It's as if he was quietly gathering data on social dynamics, even if he didn't feel fully able to participate.
Precisely. He was in a position to observe the nuances of social engagement, to learn the implicit rules and expectations by watching others navigate those interactions, even if he didn't yet possess the confidence or skills to fully engage himself.
The encounter with Marlisa, despite its somewhat awkward and disappointing conclusion, is highlighted in the guide as a significant turning point in Bruce's understanding of rejection and vulnerability. It wasn't a resounding success, but it was a crucial step into the unknown territory of romantic connection.
It was a real-world experience that challenged any idealized expectations he might have held and forced him to confront the possibility of misinterpreting social signals and the emotional pain of not having his feelings reciprocated in the way he had hoped. These experiences, even the difficult ones, are often essential for growth.
Yeah. The guide also foreshadows the idea of earned secure attachment, developing through intentional effort, but also acknowledges its fragility and the potential for future disruptions. It suggests that Bruce's journey toward healthy connection wasn't going to be a straightforward or guaranteed process.
It adds a layer of realism to his story. The progress he made was hard-won and would likely continue to be tested, highlighting the ongoing nature of personal growth and the complexities of forming secure attachments, especially after early experiences of emotional deprivation.
And the concluding thought in this section of the guide is incredibly powerful. The surreal irony of growth, that someone who was raised in emotional silence and struggled with profound shyness would ultimately become a therapist, guiding others through their own journeys of connection. It really brings his entire experience into a meaningful perspective.
It speaks to the transformative power of confronting and working through one's own deepest challenges. By navigating his own difficulties with such courage and persistence, Bruce developed a profound level of understanding, empathy, and insight that would ultimately inform his ability to help others facing similar struggles.
So for you, our listener, what really stands out in Bruce's early college journey? We've seen his intense feelings of shyness and invisibility, but also his remarkable efforts to actively confront and overcome these significant challenges. What feels most powerful in his story?
What I find most powerful is Bruce's consistent willingness to step outside his comfort zone, even when it was clearly terrifying for him. From that initial decision to approach strangers about fraternity parties to the vulnerable act of attempting a first kiss, he repeatedly pushed against his limitations. And even in the face of setbacks and disappointments, he continued to seek help and learn new ways of relating to the world. That resilience and determination to overcome such deep-seated shyness is truly inspiring.
And what aspects of Bruce's experiences do you think would make someone want to read his full memoir? What's the hook that might draw a reader in?
I think it's the universality of his struggle with shyness and the desire for connection, coupled with the very specific details of his journey. Many people can relate to feeling unseen or awkward in social situations. Bruce's story offers a compelling example of someone who not only experienced these feelings intensely, but also actively sought ways to change. The insights he gained through therapy, his often humorous steps, and his eventual progress offer a relatable and hopeful narrative for anyone who has ever felt invisible or struggled to connect. The surreal irony of growth, his transformation into a therapist, also adds a fascinating layer that promises deeper insights into the human condition.
Consider this final thought. Think about the immense courage it requires for someone who feels fundamentally invisible to actively try to make themselves seen in the world. And how even those seemingly small interactions, a hesitant question, an awkward dance, a tentative invitation, can represent enormous personal growth when you're battling that level of shyness and social anxiety. Bruce's early college years provide a powerful glimpse into the possibility of change and self-reclamation, suggesting that his full memoir could be a profoundly insightful and resonant read for anyone who has ever felt unseen or longed for deeper connection.